Hello, everyone. I am so glad you're here with me today. Thank you for taking this time to listen and to learn with me. Today, we're going on a very big journey through time and across land and sea. We'll travel across the ocean, through giant forests, over golden deserts, and into the heart of a story that helps explain how our world works today. We're going to talk about a continent called Africa. Before we begin, I want you to take a deep breath. Close your eyes for just a moment. Picture a map in your mind. Africa is that giant piece of land right in the middle of the world. Huge, varied, and full of life. It is so big that you could fit the United States, China, India, and almost all of Europe inside it and still have some room left. Pause. Breathe out. Africa is a place where the sun often shines bright, where the first humans lived, and where some of the most amazing kingdoms and traditions were built. Have you ever wondered why that is? Was Africa always behind? The short answer is no, not at all. The long answer, that's the story for today. It's a heavy phrase, and it needs careful explanation. In plain words, it means this. At many points in history, resources, human, natural, and intellectual, were taken from Africa and used to build wealth in other places. That didn't happen by accident. It happened through choices and systems. Trade, slavery, colonization, and economic rules that favored other nations. Over the next chapters, we'll look at amazing civilizations before European domination, the painful history of the transatlantic slave trade and its long consequences, the Berlin Conference and colonial rule, how outsiders divided a continent on a map and built systems to extract wealth, how those systems shaped trade, education, and even how people thought of themselves. What happened after independence, and why many of the problems didn't simply disappear when colonial flags were lowered. And finally, we'll talk about the remarkable comeback, the modern creativity, technology, and energy coming out of Africa today, and practical ways listeners can help make the future fairer. That's a lot. We'll go slowly. I'll tell stories, give examples, and give you time to think about what it all means. Ready? Let's go. Chapter 1. Before Contact. Pre-colonial Africa. Imagine stepping into a time machine and traveling back 500, 800, or 1,000 years. What would you see? You would see cities and kingdoms full of life and learning. Places with markets, schools, craftsmen, and scholars. You would find people growing crops, building great stone walls and palaces, forging iron, carving statues, and writing books on beautiful paper. You would find complex systems of law and governance, where people debated and reached decisions, and you'd see networks of trade spreading across deserts and along rivers. Let me tell you about a few places that will help us picture how rich and diverse pre-colonial Africa was. First, the Empire of Mali. If you've heard one name from that era, it might be Mansa Musa. He ruled in the early 1300s and is often called one of the richest people in history. His wealth was tied to vast gold deposits in West Africa, but his significance goes beyond gold. During his pilgrimage to Mecca, his generosity, giving away gold, was so legendary that it affected local economies for years. That journey also showed how Mali was connected to the wider world, to cities like Cairo, and to trade routes stretching across the Sahara. Now picture Timbuktu. Today, the name often evokes romantic images. In the past, Timbuktu was a real center of learning. We're talking of hundreds of teachers, thousands of students, and scores of libraries and manuscripts. Scholars there studied law, astronomy, mathematics, medicine, poetry, and religion. Students traveled from distant places to study and debate. Timbuktu was, in many ways, a university city, a place of ideas, books, and scholarship. Head further south, and you find Great Zimbabwe. There, in the highlands, people built massive stone structures and enclosures using huge cut stones stacked without mortar, and they were both practical and symbolic centers of power and trade. These stoneworks show architectural skill and a level of organization that surprised early European visitors, and still does today. Travel west a little, and you'd find the Kingdom of Benin, not only for its governance, but for incredible bronze casting. The Benin bronzes are masterpieces, figures, plaques, and objects made with lost wax casting that show craftsmanship on the highest level. These objects tell us about history, court life, trade, and people's artistic sensibilities. In Central Africa, the Kingdom of Congo had complex political systems and diplomatic ties with Portugal far earlier than many realize.
In East Africa, Swahili city-states such as Kilwa and Mombasa were thriving cosmopolitan ports where traders from across the Indian Ocean met and exchanged goods and ideas. Arabic, Persian, Indian, and African cultures blending together. And in the forest and savanna, specialized farming systems, farming techniques adapted to local environments, and iron-working technology used for tools and weapons. Many societies had local assemblies, councils, and systems of law, governance that fit their cultural context. Pause and imagine the sounds, market voices, haggling, the rhythm of forging iron, the quiet of libraries, the laughter of children, storytellers recounting history by the fire. This is not an empty continent. It is full of life, full of knowledge, full of systems, very much like the world we know today, with long histories we must honor. So why do we not always learn this in school? Why do so many textbooks start a little later, as if history begins at contact? That's part of the story we'll explore. Chapter 2: First Encounters and Trade. Contact before catastrophe. When European ships first arrived along the African coasts, in many places the relationship began as trade. For centuries before, African kingdoms had been trading across the Sahara and the Indian Ocean. New ships meant more kinds of goods to exchange: metals, cloth, salt, and eventually, tragically, people. For a time, the interaction was similar to two neighbors trading. European goods like metal tools, textiles, and new ideas were exchanged for African gold, ivory, and other goods. Many African leaders participated in trade networks on their own terms. It's important to see that the early years were not simply the story of Europe imposing itself immediately everywhere. There were negotiations, alliances, and exchanges that included African agency. But over time, the balance of power shifted. Demand from Europe, and later for plantations in the Americas, changed the scale and purpose of trade. As new markets opened across the Atlantic, the demand for labor skyrocketed. When Europeans turned to the transatlantic slave trade, they were not only trading goods anymore, they created an industry of human capture and forced migration, with devastating consequences. Chapter 3: The Transatlantic Slave Trade. The transatlantic slave trade is one of the darkest chapters in human history.
Between the 15th and 19th centuries, millions of Africans were captured, enslaved, and transported across the ocean to the Americas. This trade was not abstract numbers. Every statistic represents people, mothers, fathers, children, artisans, leaders, healers, storytellers, farmers. Let's try to picture some of the consequences in human terms. Imagine a village where a significant share of the strongest, most skilled adults are taken away. The farmers who understand the seasons, the builders who know how to raise houses, the blacksmith who makes tools, gone. Communities were stripped of their human capital. The immediate effect was a drop in production and social stability. The long-term effect, fewer births, disrupted family lines, the fracturing of cultural knowledge passed down through generations. Beyond the sheer number of people, there was a particular kind of loss. Many of the people taken were young adults, the ones who would have been parents, innovators, and future leaders. This created demographic imbalances that affected communities and their ability to rebuild. We must also consider the ways the trade was organized. Europeans relied on African intermediaries, local rulers, and traders. In many cases, the arrival of European weapons and demand for captives sparked an intensified conflict between groups. Arms traded for captives changed local power dynamics, enabling more conquest and more capture. Over time, the trade fed cycles of violence and instability. Another major effect was the cultural loss. Enslaved people were often forbidden from practicing their religions or speaking their languages. Children born into slavery in the Americas learned new languages and had to build new cultural identities, which eventually created the African diaspora, communities across the Americas and the Caribbean with African roots, shaping music, food, language, and society there. Listened carefully? Pause. Remember, while the slave trade happened across the ocean, its effects reached deep into African societies, economic, social, and psychological, for centuries afterward. Chapter 4. The Scramble for Africa, Berlin and the Partition. Fast forward a few hundred years to the 19th century. The Industrial Revolution in Europe meant factories, machines, and a huge demand for raw materials. Europe's appetite for rubber, metals, palm oil, cotton, and more grew.
European states wanted territories to supply those raw materials and also to build trading empires and political prestige. In 1884-1885, a meeting known as the Berlin Conference took place. What happened there is shocking when you imagine it. European leaders with maps and rulers dividing up a continent they knew little about. There were no African voices in that room. The map was cut into pieces according to European convenience, not local realities. The borders drawn became the modern borders of many African states. Those lines cut across ethnic groups, linked distant peoples together, and split communities. Sometimes a town found itself in two different colonies on opposite sides of an arbitrary line. This created problems that would follow these nations long after colonial rule ended. Different colonial powers used different ruling styles. Some used a system called indirect rule, working through local leaders and chiefs to govern. Others adopted direct rule, replacing local structures with European administrators and systems. In some places, colonizers attempted to impose their language, education, and law. In others, they allowed more local autonomy. But across the continent, a common theme emerged. Systems were designed primarily to extract resources and to ensure control, not to foster independent development for local people. Chapter 5: Extractive Infrastructure. Roads, railways, and sticks to the sea. When the Europeans built infrastructure, the roads, the railways, the ports, they often intended them to go from an interior mine, plantation, or farm straight to the coast. If you looked at those rails on a map, you'd see many lines that run like straws from the resource point to the port. Why? Because the goal was extraction. To move minerals, agricultural goods, and raw materials out quickly, cheaply, and efficiently. These lines did not connect towns and cities across the interior in the ways a continent building for itself would. They were not designed for local trade, for people to travel for education or commerce between cities, or to integrate regional economies. They were built to move goods out. This pattern had long-term consequences. Economies were structured around raw exports rather than diverse industries. Local value-adding industries, the factories that turned raw cocoa into chocolate bars or copper ore into electronics, were mostly located in Europe. That meant profits and jobs stayed elsewhere.
Let's use a simple example to make this concrete. Imagine a cocoa farmer in West Africa who grows beans. Those beans are exported abroad, processed, and turned into high-value chocolate bars there. The farmer sells the beans for a small fraction of the final price. Who profits the most? Those who control the processing and branding far from the farm. That pattern repeats for gold, oil, diamonds, and many other products. Think about every item in your house that needs raw materials: batteries, electronics, clothing, chocolate. Many of those raw ingredients may have left their places of origin with very little added value benefiting local communities. Chapter 6: Laws, Education, Language, Shaping Minds and Systems. The colonizers not only took material resources, but also tried to reshape minds and institutions. Schools were set up, but often to produce clerks and workers for the colonial administration, not to foster local engineers, scientists, or business leaders. In many places, education prioritized teaching European history, languages, and values. Local histories, customs, and languages were devalued. Language policy mattered. In territories ruled by the British, English often became the language of government and education. In French colonies, French. In Portuguese colonies, Portuguese. While these languages sometimes connected people across regions and did give access to global markets, they also marginalized local languages and traditions, and sometimes alienated people from their own past. Health and medicine were affected too. Traditional healing knowledge was often dismissed as superstition, even though many traditional remedies were valuable and practical. The colonial state sometimes discouraged these practices and failed to equip local health systems adequately. Where hospitals were built, they often served the settlers more than the general population. The cumulative result: institutions were built to sustain colonial power and extraction. When independence came, many of these institutions were left in place: schools that produced clerks, railways that ran to ports, legal systems patterned after European law, but not always matched to the needs of newly independent nations. Chapter 7: Independence, Freedom and Fragile Beginnings. Across the 1950s and 1960s, many African nations regained political independence.
These were nights of joy.
People danced in the streets, raised their flags, and celebrated the restoration of self-rule. Independence leaders had vision and hope. They wanted rapid development, schools, hospitals, industries, and the dignity of self-direction. But there were huge challenges left by colonial systems. Borders drawn without regard for local realities. Economies set up for raw exports to old colonial partners. Limited managerial and technical experience among local populations, because under colonialism, those roles were often reserved for Europeans. Heavy foreign influence remained. Foreign companies, foreign banks, and economic rules that had not disappeared. Some nations fared better than others. Some formed regional alliances. Others faced coups or civil wars. Independence didn't automatically mean equitable distribution of resources or immediate industrial capacity. Many new governments had to contend with high expectations and very limited resources. One more factor to consider: Cold War geopolitics. As nations sought development and alignment, the United States and the Soviet Union often competed for influence in Africa. This external competition sometimes fueled internal instability, but it also led to aid and investment with strings attached. Pause. Listen to that. Independence was a beginning, not a cure. The structural legacies of colonialism remained, and rebuilding would take sustained, determined effort. Chapter 8. The Economic Chains. Who gains and who loses? To understand underdevelopment, we must look at how global trade and money flows work. When a country sells raw materials, it receives money for those exports. But the final products made from those raw materials, electronics, refined metals, packaged foods, sell for much higher prices, and the profits often go to companies based in other countries. This is the central problem. Many African countries exported low-value raw materials while importing high-value manufactured goods. Also consider debt. After independence, many countries borrowed money to build infrastructure. Sometimes those loans financed useful projects. Other times, loans were poorly managed, corrupt, or imposed under unfair conditions. Debt payments can consume a big portion of government budgets, leaving less money for schools, hospitals, and development.
A country rich in natural resources can paradoxically end up with slower, broader development if resource wealth is controlled by a small elite or by foreign companies, rather than used to build public goods. When wealth flows to a few, investment in education and health may suffer, and political instability can result. Finally, global trade rules and the power of multinational corporations often gave an advantage to the buyers of raw materials, not the producers. That structural imbalance meant profits went elsewhere, while the producers bore environmental and social costs. Chapter 9. Cultural Effects and Losses. Beyond economics and politics, colonization affected how people saw themselves and their past. Schools and churches sometimes suggested that African history and achievements were unimportant. When a people's own stories are treated as less valuable, it becomes harder for them to take pride in their culture and to pass on knowledge. Yet, despite that, traditions persisted in secret or in family settings. Storytelling, music, craft, and oral history survived. Many African languages and practices have made profound contributions to global culture in music, food, dance, oral poetry, and more. Think of the global influence. Rhythms of West African music reverberate in jazz, blues, and much of modern Western music.
And in the Americas, many cultural practices are direct continuations of African traditions adapted to new lands. This resilience, the ability to preserve identity under pressure, is one of the most important themes in this whole story. Chapter 10: Case Studies. To make these ideas concrete, let's look at several case studies. Cocoa and chocolate. Cocoa farmers grow the beans. Those beans travel abroad, get processed into chocolate, branded and sold at high margins. Farmers often get very small shares of the final revenue. Because of colonial and post-colonial trade patterns, local processing capacity was limited. Fair trade movement and cooperatives today work to change that, but the imbalance still exists. Congo and cobalt. The Democratic Republic of the Congo has among the world's largest deposits of cobalt, crucial to batteries and electronics. Yet many Congolese communities see little of the wealth derived from the mines. Issues with child labor, unsafe working conditions, and weak governance have allowed foreign companies to extract wealth without sufficient local benefit.
This is an acute example of how resource wealth does not automatically translate into shared prosperity. Diamonds and South Africa. The growth of mining industries created immense wealth, but the distribution of that wealth was deeply inequitable during colonial and apartheid eras. Labor exploitation, segregation, and concentrated ownership shaped social and economic life for generations. Oil. In Nigeria, oil wealth has been both a blessing and a curse. While oil brought national revenues, the oil-producing regions often suffered environmental damage and felt excluded from the benefits. Corruption, mismanagement, and conflict around who gets the oil wealth have been persistent problems. Each case shows a pattern: resource extraction without adequate local value addition, weak regulatory systems, environmental harm, and limited community benefit. Chapter 11: Education, Knowledge Revival, and the Brain Drain. We've mentioned education before, but let's return to it with more detail. Under colonial rule, most educational efforts trained people for colonial jobs. After independence, newly sovereign states prioritized education, building schools, universities, and scholarship programs. This was essential to building local capacity. However, a challenge emerged: the brain drain. Many talented scientists, doctors, engineers, and academics moved to Europe, North America, or elsewhere where salaries and opportunities were higher. They left valuable skills behind. Why would a brilliant doctor trained with national funds move abroad, often to earn more, to access better facilities, or to secure a stable future for family members? The brain drain reduces the human capital available for development at home. That said, many in the diaspora contribute back through remittances, investments, knowledge exchange, and return migration. The diaspora is an important bridge, but to fully benefit from it, nations often need policies that attract and retain talent, good pay, research funding, career prospects, and supportive institutions. Meanwhile, many African nations have been reviving local knowledge, studying traditional agriculture, indigenous medicines, and community governance. There's a growing sense that development should combine modern science with local wisdom. Chapter 12: Neocolonialism, Debt, and Global Rules. Neocolonialism is a term often used to describe the continuation of foreign influence after formal colonial rule ended. It includes economic dependencies, terms of trade that favor developed countries, multinational corporations that control key sectors, and international financial systems that influence domestic policy through loans and aid conditions. In the 1980s and 1990s, many African nations faced debt crises. Loans taken for development sometimes came with policy conditions set by lenders, such as privatization or spending cuts, that could constrain government's ability to invest in social services. Those structural adjustment programs were controversial because while they aimed to stabilize economies, they often produced social strain. So when we talk about underdevelopment continuing past independence, these mechanisms help explain why. International rules, debt structures, and corporate power can keep resources and decision-making centered outside of local control. Chapter 13: Resistance and Agency. People who fought back. It's important to highlight agency, the many ways African people resisted and adapted. Anti-colonial movements organized protests, strikes, and political campaigns that led to independence. Figures like Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya, Patrice Lumumba in the Congo, and many others were central to national movements. Ordinary people organized mutual aid networks, preserved languages, and sustained cultures in informal ways. Women played crucial roles in resistance and in community life, organizing protests, leading markets, and keeping families and traditions alive. Intellectuals, writers, and artists kept history alive in literature and art, reminding the world of African creativity and resilience. Their stories remind us, history is not only the work of leaders on a stage, it is the persistent everyday courage of millions. Chapter 14: The Modern Renaissance. Technology, creativity, and youth. Now, let's move to brighter news. Innovation and culture are booming across many parts of Africa. This is the part of the story that fills me with hope. First, demography. More than half of Africa's population is under the age of 20. That means vast energy, creativity, and the potential for rapid change if opportunities are available. That young population is launching startups, creating new cultural forms, and reimagining politics. Second, technology. Mobile phones and mobile money platforms have transformed daily life.
In East Africa, mobile payment systems allowed people to send money, save, and access services without relying on traditional banks. That leapfrog, moving past older infrastructure into new technology, is an African success story. Tech hubs from Lagos to Nairobi to Cape Town create apps, fintech services, and new business models adapted to local needs. Third, the creative industries. Nollywood, Nigeria's film industry, now produces films watched across Africa and beyond. Music genres like Afrobeats are global, with performers topping charts and performing on world stages. Fashion, art, literature, African creatives are shaping global culture. Fourth, renewable energy and sustainable agriculture. Many innovators work on solar energy solutions, water-saving agriculture, and community-driven projects. These efforts combine local knowledge with new technologies to produce sustainable development. All of this demonstrates something fundamental. When people have tools, education, and opportunity, they build. They reinvest and create locally relevant solutions. Chapter 15. What can listeners do? Practical actions. If you've listened this far, you may be asking, what can I do to help make things fairer? Here are practical everyday ways people can support more equitable development. Consume thoughtfully. Buy fair trade products where possible. Learn which brands invest in supply chain fairness. Small choices by millions of consumers can change market incentives. Support African businesses and artists. Buy music, films, books, and products that come directly from African creators. Attend exhibits, share content, and champion local artists. Listen to African voices. Follow journalists, scholars, writers, and activists from Africa. Read their work, amplify their perspectives, and prioritize first-hand accounts. Support policies for fair trade and debt relief. Advocate for political leaders to support fair trade rules and responsible lending. Public pressure matters. Donate wisely. If you support NGOs, research which organizations work closely with local communities and focus on capacity building.
Learn and teach. Share what you learned today. Encourage fair and accurate history education. The more people know the true story, the more pressure there will be for systemic change. Invest ethically. If you have capital, consider impact investing that supports local businesses and sustainable projects. Promote transparency and local ownership.
Visit responsibly. If you travel, do so in a way that respects local communities and supports local economies.
Imagine a beautiful garden managed by many families. Some families had their soil taken, their water pipes redirected, and some of their gardeners taken. Then the garden became fenced off in parts, and the management of the garden served the interests of those outside the gate for a long time. Now imagine people gradually clearing weeds, restoring soil, and planting new seeds. That is the work of rebuilding. It can be messy, slow, and sometimes painful, but it is real. These metaphors help us remember that development is not merely a question of individual effort. It is about structures, history, and fairness. Chapter 18. Stories of Resilience. Individuals and Communities. Let me share some short vignettes that show resilience. These are meant to be representative rather than exhaustive. A small co-op of cocoa farmers in a West African village decide to process and package cocoa locally. They begin to sell branded chocolate to niche markets overseas. The profits fund schools and clean water. The village regains skills that were at risk of being lost. A group of engineers in a coastal city design a low-cost solar panel that can be manufactured locally and withstand tropical humidity. They train technicians across the region, creating jobs and reducing energy costs. An independent filmmaker from a small town makes a film about family life. The film resonates worldwide, bringing attention to local issues and opening doors for other storytellers. Young activists create a civic technology platform that connects citizens with local government services and boosts transparency and participation. These stories show how change can be practical and bottom-up. They are powered by people who stay, return, or connect from abroad. They combine skill, imagination, and networks. Chapter 19. The Diaspora. Connections across the ocean. The African Diaspora. Communities descended from Africa, across the Americas, Europe, and elsewhere, play a powerful role in modern Africa. Through remittances, entrepreneurship, cultural exchange, and advocacy, the diaspora invests in and supports development. When people move, they carry with them knowledge, skills, and networks. The challenge is to make sure diaspora connections benefit both places, not just by sending money back, but by building lasting institutional ties, joint ventures, research partnerships, cultural programs, and long-term investments.
We should remember too that the diaspora shaped the cultures of the Americas profoundly. Music, food, religion, language. Those cultural connections create pathways for collaboration today in arts, trade, and diplomacy. Chapter 20. Environment, Agriculture, and Sustainability. Colonial cash crop agriculture often prioritized short-term export profits over long-term land health. Crops planted year after year without rotation, large monoculture plantations, and extractive mining damaged soils and ecosystems. In recent decades, many African farmers and scientists have been restoring soil health through traditional and modern techniques, crop rotation, agroforestry, mixed cropping, and regenerative practices. Communities are replanting trees, restoring watersheds, and protecting biodiversity. Sustainable agriculture and green energy can be huge economic opportunities if paired with fair investment and local capacity building. Solar energy, for instance, is abundant in many regions and can provide decentralized power where national grids are weak. Chapter 21: Governance and Regional Cooperation. No single country can solve global unfairness alone. Regional cooperation, economic unions, shared infrastructure plans, and coordinated trade policies can strengthen bargaining power and enable larger projects. Organizations such as continental bodies, regional economic communities, and trading blocs are tools countries can use to coordinate. The effectiveness of these institutions depends on political will, public support, and practical capacity. When successful, cooperation reduces dependence on distant markets and builds integrated continental value chains. Good governance also matters. Transparent institutions, accountable leadership, and investments in education and infrastructure create the environment where development can thrive. Chapter 22: Learning from Others, Examples from Around the World. History offers models. Some countries that were once poor have transformed through a mix of public investment, education, industrial policy, and wise use of resources. Asia is often cited. Nations that invested in education and manufacturing and that used targeted policies to support new industries achieved rapid industrialization. That doesn't mean copying models exactly. Each place has its own context.
But the lesson is that deliberate policies, investment in human capital, infrastructure that serves local needs, and institutions that promote fairness make a difference. Chapter 23: The Moral Case. Why equity matters for everyone. When wealth and opportunity are concentrated and others are excluded, the entire world loses. Innovation, culture, and new ideas come from diversity. When Africa thrives, the whole world benefits. New medicines, artistic expression, business models, and technologies that come from diverse experiences enrich everyone. Justice matters not just for its own sake, but because fairness unlocks potential. Removing barriers and sharing benefits stimulates innovation and makes the global system more resilient. Chapter 24: Recap: The Big Threads. Let's pull everything together. Pre-colonial greatness. Africa had rich civilizations, scholarship, and technical skill long before colonial interference. The slave trade. Devastating human loss and structural damage, removing people and leadership. Colonial extraction. Infrastructure and institutions built for extraction. Railways to the sea, raw material economies, education for colonial roles. Post-independence challenges. Borders, debt, institutional gaps, and continued external influences slowed reconstruction. Modern resurgence. Youth, technology, creative industries, and renewed policy attention are driving an African renaissance. Ways to help. Ethical consumption, listening to local voices, fair trade, diaspora engagement, and support for local businesses. Pause. Let those ideas sit for a moment. Use these lines when talking to friends or in classrooms. They are short, accurate, and powerful. Chapter 26. Final Stories of Hope. Before we close, one last set of stories to inspire. A town that lost its youth to migration creates a coding academy that trains young people who then build companies solving local problems. A coastal community affected by oil pollution wins a court case and uses reparations to fund health clinics and schools. A farmers' cooperative adopts regenerative agriculture, restoring soil and increasing yields, so children can stay in school rather than work in fields. These are small ripples that add up. Each one is proof that people can change systems when they work together, that fairness is built step by step.
Chapter 27. Closing. 3 things to remember. As we finish our talk today, I want you to remember 3 big things. First, Africa was not always poor. It was and is a place of richness, learning, and deep human creativity. Second, underdevelopment was not an accident. It was produced through systems of theft and unequal exchange, the slave trade, colonization, and unequal global rules. Third, the story is not finished. African people are rebuilding, innovating, and reclaiming control. The future is being written now. When you see a map of the world next time, look at Africa and see not a single story, but the kingdoms of the past, the struggles of the middle, and the massive potential of the future. See a place that has given so much to the world, and a place that is taking its rightful spot as a leader in our global family. Thank you for listening carefully today. History can be hard to talk about, especially the sad parts. But when we speak honestly about the past, we become kinder and smarter about the future. The more we learn and share, the more we can help build a world where every person has the chance to develop their own potential. Keep asking big questions. Keep learning. Keep listening. Goodbye for now.